Hey Optimancers, Chris here. Today I want to talk about Phantom Steed. It's a 3rd level spell with the ritual tag, meaning if the caster has ritual casting, they can add 10 minutes to the spell casting time, and they can cast it without expending a spell slot. The duration is 1 hour, no concentration, so there's no reason you can't cast this multiple times and get multiple mounts. The spell is only on the wizard spell list, but the undead warlock gets to add it to the warlock spell list. Though keep in mind that warlocks don't get ritual casting as a class feature, but they can take the Book of Ancient Secrets invocation if they take Pact of the Tome, which allows ritual casting of their spells. Bards can also access Phantom Steed with magical secrets, and they do get ritual casting as a class feature. And finally, the ritual caster feat can allow any character, even non-spellcasters, to cast Phantom Steed as a ritual, but they need to get access to the spell through a scroll or a spellbook, so they can add it to their ritual book. Once we cast it, a quasi-like real horse-like creature appears on the ground in an unoccupied space of your choice within 30 feet. The creature uses the statistics of a riding horse. Here's the riding horse. Armor class 10, movement 60 feet, hooves attack for a +5 to hit and a 2d4 +3 damage, 13 hit points. Okay, back to the spell. It says that the exception to the riding horse's statistics is the Phantom Steed has 100-foot movement and can travel 10 miles per hour or 13 at a fast pace. You decide the horse-like creature's appearance, and it comes with its own saddle, bit, and bridle. These vanish if they're moved more than 10 feet away from the steed. For the duration of the spell, you or a creature that you can choose can ride the steed. When the spell ends, the steed gradually fades, giving the rider 1 minute to dismount. So, in addition to the spell ending when the duration is over, it can also end if we use our bonus action to dismiss it, or if the steed takes any damage at all. Okay, so that is the spell. First, let's look at movement. So, we already know that the combat movement of a riding horse is 60 feet, and the combat movement of a phantom steed is 100. But we're also given out-of-combat travel speeds of 10 miles per hour or 13 miles per hour at a fast pace. So how fast is that? Well, let's look at the out-of-combat movement rules. Normal movement is 3 miles per hour or 4 miles per hour if we're moving at a fast pace. Now, how does a mount affect that? It says a mounted character can gallop for about an hour, covering twice the usual distance for a fast pace, so that would be 8 miles in 1 hour well mounted. But also, we have that 1 hour limit. So if we want to consistently travel at the fast pace, we have to switch out mounts every hour, which the rules remind us would be very rare except in densely populated areas. Now, the one thing here that might be surprising to some of you is there is no change listed here to your normal movement. So unless we're galloping, which is limited to an hour or about an hour, then being mounted actually doesn't change our out-of-combat movement rate at all. 3 miles per hour at a normal pace or 4 miles per hour at a fast pace. So when we're talking about overland travel, a Phantom Steed is a lot faster than being mounted on a horse. We're talking a little over triple the movement. Now I don't know if this is what the designers intended, but it says that a Phantom Steed moves 10 miles per hour at a normal pace or 13 miles per hour at a fast pace, but the mounts and vehicles rules say for short spans of time up to an hour, which conveniently is the duration of a Phantom Steed. Many animals move much faster than the humanoids. A mounted character can ride at a gallop for about an hour, covering twice the usual distance for fast pace. So potentially we could read that if it has a 13 mile per hour fast pace, if it gallops, that could be 26 miles per hour. It could be read the other way though, because it says that covering twice the usual distance for a fast pace. Well, 13 miles per hour isn't the usual distance for a fast pace, so maybe that doesn't apply with Phantom Steed. And I haven't seen an official ruling on this, so it's really up to your DM if you can gallop to double that fast movement speed to go 26 miles per hour. But one way or the other, it's a lot faster than your standard mounted travel pace. So let's say you have 5 party members. Then creating mounts for all of them, casting ritually, would take 55 minutes and the mounts last for 1 hour. Which leads to the next question. Can you gallop on a mount and cast a ritual spell? If so, then one player could indeed gallop on a phantom steed while constantly refreshing phantom steeds for a party of 5. Here we have to look at the rules for spell casting. So, with a casting time of 11 minutes, we need to look at the rules for longer casting times. They say when you cast a spell with a casting time of longer than a single action or reaction, you must spend your action each turn casting the spell. That's not a problem, we're out of combat. It says we also maintain our concentration while casting, and if the concentration is broken, the spell fails. Okay, so let's look at concentration and how concentration can be broken. It says that normal activity doesn't interfere with concentration, but these following factors can break it. Casting another concentration spell. Not a problem, we'd be casting these one at a time. Taking damage. Well, out of combat, hopefully not a problem. Being incapacitated or killed, definitely, hopefully not a problem. And the DM might decide that environmental phenomena could require a concentration save at a DC of 10 to maintain concentration. So, is this environmental phenomena that could interfere with concentration? The rules aren't that specific. All they say is it's up to the DM. If it is, then unless we're guaranteed at least a 10 on a concentration save, then we're unlikely to make the 66 saving throws in a row that will be required to cast this spell once. So, check with your DM. The other option I should at least mention is you could actually expend your spell slots, thus you'd be able to cast this spell in 1 minute. If we do that, even if you can't cast while galloping, you can create the mounts much more quickly. But for any extended traveling, your spell slots are going to run out like really fast. Here's where I point out the advantages of perhaps having more than one player character having this spell. If you can't gallop and cast, 2 player characters could probably spend half their time casting, and the party could be galloping the other half of the time, more or less doubling what could normally be achieved with the fast pace, and roughly equaling what could be achieved by constantly refreshing horses. But what about in combat? Well, here's the first question. Can the Phantom Steed be used in combat? Or is it just supposed to be an out-of-combat utility travel spell? Well, the spell does tell us to use the statistics of a riding horse. According to the rules on mounted combat, a willing creature that is at least 1 size larger than you and that has the appropriate anatomy, which presumably a horse does, can serve as a mount. So far, I think we're fine. What about controlling a mount? Well, it says you can control a mount only if it has been trained to accept a rider. Domesticated horses, donkeys, and similar creatures are assumed to have such training. We're literally using the statistics of a riding horse, so I think we're okay. Now, did the designers intend this to be used in combat though? Well, I don't read minds, but out of combat, we use travel pace rules. The 100-foot movement speed is really only relevant in combat. So I think we've got pretty clear design intent here because they provided both out-of-combat travel pace as well as combat movement speed in the spell text. If they didn't intend it for combat, then this part here really shouldn't be in the spell text. Okay, so if we can use it in combat, let's talk about survivability, because the spell says the spell ends if the steed takes any damage. So 1 damage and the spell is over. But is it really? And even if your phantom steed is shot out from under you, it takes a minute to dissolve, giving you roughly an entire combat to use it still. I guess I don't understand the concern for phantom steed's health. When it is hit, it disappears over the course of a minute. That's easily enough to finish most combats, right? So it is essentially invincible for that purpose. I don't think so. So here is the spell again. What they're referring to is the part that says, when the spell ends, the steed gradually fades, giving the rider 1 minute to dismount. But the context is important here. This is part of an entire paragraph. The beginning of that same paragraph starts this all out by saying, for the duration, you or a creature you can choose can ride the steed. When a spell ends, the duration is over. So the clause about riding the steed ends too. The part about the 1 minute afterwards creates a specific exception, allowing you to dismount. So that's all that minute is giving you. Otherwise, the end of the spell ends everything else in the spell text. including the part where it says you can ride. And frankly, even the 1 minute to dismount is going to be reliant on the mount not being dead. I mean, if it takes 1 damage, the spell ends, and now you have a minute to dismount while the steed fades. But what if it takes 13 damage? Does the spell say that the creature uses the statistics of a riding horse except that it's immune to dying? If the horse dies, your dismount is taken care of for you. If your mount is knocked prone, you can use your reaction to dismount it as it falls and land on your feet. Otherwise, you are dismounted and fall prone in a space within 5 feet of it. So, a Phantom Steed can be used in combat, but if it takes any damage, the spell ends. Now we have a minute to dismount the fading horse, unless it takes 13 or more damage, in which case we either fall prone or we use our reaction to land on our feet. Either way though, if it takes damage, the spell ends. Now, I want to take a look at the mounted combatant feat and see how it could interact with Phantom Steed. You are a dangerous foe to face while mounted. While you're mounted and aren't incapacitated, you gain the following benefits. I want to intersect here that if a steed is fading but isn't dead, we are still technically mounted. So in that situation, you would technically still gain these benefits. You can't actually ride anywhere, but if you don't need to move, the benefits here you would have. First, you have advantage on melee attack rolls against any unmounted creature that is smaller than your mount. So a riding horse is large sized, so you would have advantage to attack unmounted medium or smaller creatures. You can force an attack targeted at your mount to target you instead. Now, I think this could be really handy, and I think for obvious reasons, considering what we just talked about. Finally, if your mount is subjected to an effect that allows it to make a dexterity saving throw to take only half damage, it instead takes no damage if it succeeds on the saving throw, and only half damage if it fails. Okay, so what this means is, even if our Phantom Steed was hit by a fireball, if it makes it save, then it takes no damage. And if it takes no damage, the spell does not end. The problem is, I wouldn't expect a steed with a dexterity save bonus of 0 to make that saving throw, and half damage will still end the spell. Okay, so let's talk about controlled and uncontrolled mounts. We've already determined a Phantom Steed can be either, our choice when we mount it. This says an independent mount retains its place in the initiative order. So basically, you're rolling the mount's initiative and your initiative separately. Bearing a rider puts no restrictions on the actions the mount can take, and it moves and acts as it wishes. So an uncontrolled mount is just that, not under your control. I want to do the hooves attack, but you might just find yourself dashing away from combat with a 100-foot movement speed. I think we kind of have to go with a controlled mount. Okay, so according to this, the initiative of a controlled mount changes to match yours when you mount it. It moves as you direct it, and it has only 3 action options: dash, disengage, and dodge. A controlled mount can move and act even on the turn that you mount it. I'm going to repeat that last part. A controlled mount can move and act even on the turn that you mount it. Assuming you mount it on your turn, which I would imagine would be the normal case, that means it can move and act on your turn when you mount it. But what about on the following round? Can it still move and act on your turn? I still don't understand the logic of why the mount goes on your turn instead of its own turn. Jeremy Crawford's tweets clarify that a controlled mount acts on its own separate turn. So here is what Jeremy Crawford has tweeted. He said, a rider and a controlled mount have separate turns, but they have the same initiative, which means you decide which one goes first. He's also said a controlled mount has its own turn, but that turn takes place on the same initiative count as the rider's turn. Does that mean that one of their turns has to end before the other begins? Because that doesn't match what the rules say.
If you decide you're controlling the mount, the creature's initiative changes to your initiative. It still has a turn, but its turn basically overlaps with yours. It gets its move, and so part of the advantage of this is basically it's moving on your turn, so it's then far easier for your character to coordinate with the mount.
Right.
And the beauty of it acting on your turn to make it its turn overlapping with yours is that then Also, your movement is still free to use on your own turn, and all your actions are still available.
So the mount has its own turn, which overlaps with the rider's turn. Or at least that's what Jeremy Crawford says. But is that actually the rules as written, or just the way he intends them to work? It's actually both. Here is why it is actually rules as written that the turns have to overlap. Here's how initiative works. The order of turns is determined at the beginning of a combat encounter. That's it. Once the initiative order is determined, it does not change. That's a general rule. However, the rules on controlling a mount create a specific exception to that rule. The initiative of a controlled mount changes to match yours when you mount it. Now, as far as I know, this is the only exception to the rule that initiative order doesn't change. If we ready an action to act outside our turn, we're not changing the initiative order. In order to actually change the initiative order, we need to control a mount on our turn. If there's another way to change the initiative order, let me know in the comments down below. I'm unaware of any. Then it says a controlled mount can move and act even on the turn that you mount it. So it's taking its turn while our turn is still in progress. Both turns taking place at overlapping times, at least on the round we mount the creature. But what about the next round? So do our turns still overlap? Well, we either change the initiative order, which is against the rules, or we don't, in which case, yes, our turns still overlap. Unless we institute a house rule that the initiative order is going to change again on the following round. But the rules don't support that. Rules is written, the turns overlap on the turn you mount it, and they must continue to overlap on following turns unless we change the initiative order, which we're not allowed to do. And Jeremy Crawford, to my knowledge, has never made a tweet or said anything in an interview that doesn't support the rules as they are written on this subject. The control mount has its own turn, but its initiative changes to match the rider, and it can move and take actions on the turn it was mounted, and therefore on every subsequent turn. So how good is this with Phantom Steed? Well, if it dashes, that's 200 feet of movement on your turn, and you can still take your actions as normal. If it disengages as its action, it can move you into melee range to make attacks and then move you out again with 100 feet of movement, and since only your own movement provokes opportunity attacks, neither you nor your steed are subject to opportunity attacks. So the steed is fragile as it gets, but while mounted, your mobility puts a 20th level monk to shame. But what if you are indoors and the mount is squeezed? Well, if the mount is squeezed, then it moves at 1/2 its movement rate, so 50 feet of movement or 100 feet dashing. That's still a ton of movement. A Phantom Steed actually moves faster while squeezed than most characters do, period. Now, there's actually a weird interaction here. I'm going to share it with you. This isn't in relation to Phantom Steeds in particular, but to the controlled mount rules in general. So, when we mount a creature trained to accept a rider, we can control it. If we control it, we have a unique exception to the rules where the mount's initiative changes to match ours, to the point where its actions and movement can be taken at the same time on our turn. This initiative change occurs when we mount the creature, and this is the only time initiative order can change, to my knowledge. But what happens if we dismount? Okay, so I should say a DM has every right to make a ruling when the rules as they're written create some weird results. I mean, that's a large part of the reason we have a DM in the first place. Here is potentially one of those cases. There's nothing in the rules about switching its initiative again if it's dismounted, and the initiative order doesn't change unless there's a specific exception noted in the rules. So the rules as they're written, the unmounted creature's initiative still matches ours, and its turn still overlaps ours. In fact, we could mount the same creature again and not control it, putting no restrictions on the actions and movement the mount can take, and if you don't control a mount, it retains its place in the initiative order. So we just got the benefit of overlapping turns from controlled mounts on an uncontrolled mount. Now, I like to point things out in the rules that are a little bit wacky, and I noticed something very recently in the rules, and I hadn't seen anyone else mention it up to now, so I'm pointing this out. This is not a recommendation to exploit it, and if you try to exploit this one, I imagine your DM is going to shut you down regardless, but I thought it was neat, and so I'm mentioning it. So, Phantom Steed, super useful spell. Can be cast without expending a spell slot if we can ritually cast. Gives us dramatic increases to overland travel and insane increases to movement in combat, but the lightest tap ends the spell, and no, you don't get one more minute to ride it afterwards. Interesting spell though, with some crazy applications. Let me know your Phantom Steed stories in the comments below. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.